Okay, welcome everyone. I think we should get started. We've got a lot to cover and a relatively short time. My name is Steve Kenzie. I'm the Executive Director of the UN Global Compact Network. Welcome to the fifth in our six-part series on Black Lives Matter and business. And today we're going to be looking at advancement. We've got a fantastic group of speakers to contribute, and I'm looking forward to a very interesting conversation. Before we get going, a little bit of housekeeping. As you join, you will be muted. This is a webinar platform, so no talking or video for you, our dear guests, but we still want you to be very actively engaged. And so there's a chat function and, even more importantly, a Q&A function. And so you are encouraged throughout the proceedings to put your questions there, preferably questions in the Q&A box, and more technical, questions for the panelists in the Q&A box, and questions for the organizers in the chat box, but we won't be too strict about that. I would like to take this opportunity to thank NatWest Group for sponsoring our Black Lives Matter in Business series, which would not have been possible without their fantastic support. And now let's go on to the first slide, which is the one where I tell those of you that are not familiar with the Global Compact a little bit about who we are. It is the world's largest responsible business initiative, connecting companies and other organizations in a global movement dedicated to driving sustainable growth. And we are the UK network. There are 69 local networks all around the world that are supporting companies that have made the commitment to the Global Compact and its 10 principles in the areas of human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. And we help make those a central part of the way companies do business. To join the Global Compact, simple. Your CEO needs to send a letter to the Secretary General, and that letter needs to have three commitments in it. Firstly, to operationalize the 10 principles in the way the business is done. Secondly, to report annually on progress towards doing that. And thirdly, to support the wider UN development agenda. At the moment, that is best defined by the Sustainable Development Goals, but clearly it gives us lots of scope to work in many areas. If you're interested in learning more about Global Compact, do get in touch. We'd love to have you involved. Next slide, please. Now, this slide just shows you on the left the 10 principles of the UN Global Compact, and on the right, the Sustainable Development Goals. And between them, showing how the goals link up to the SDGs, and also highlighting how both the principles and the SDGs are very closely linked to the Black Lives Matter movement, and how important eliminating discrimination is to this agenda. And we certainly wanted to make it really crystal clear to companies that are already participating in the Global Compact or thinking about contributing to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, that these issues that we're talking about today are absolutely central to both of those agendas, and we're not going to achieve either if we don't put a big focus on equality. I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Cynthia, who's going to tell us a little bit more about this webinar series. Cynthia.
Thank you, Steve. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today. So far, we've actually had, this is the fifth installment of a six-part webinar series. And myself and my colleague Carla wanted to develop something for businesses, specifically that where we can give them tangible takeaways, tangible to-dos when it comes to Black Lives Matter and actioning what is necessary within your organizations. I think the first webinar was all about harnessing the power of storytelling, in that hearing the stories of Black women and men within their organizations and the things that they have experienced, not only in their life, but in the corporate world, that is so clear that in many different areas, Black lives actually don't matter. And then we went on to where to start, really looking at language. What is the best language to use when it comes to Black people, Black community? Then we looked at the difference between anti-racist trainings and unconscious bias trainings. And then we also looked at the ethnicity pay gap reporting. We then had a recruitment session, really thinking about what is it that businesses should be doing? What is it that they're getting wrong when it comes to recruiting Black talent? A couple of weeks ago, we had an amazing session. They've all been amazing, but we had an amazing session on retention, really thinking about what's important when we think about retaining these Black people within organizations. And I'm really pleased that we're going to be having this advancement session today. And then in the next couple of weeks, we're going to be having our final session, our final installment, which is changing corporate culture, and where we're going to be having a C-suite level panel and looking at the top-down approach when it comes to Black Lives Matter within business. I personally have been really moved by this entire thing. I mean, I was moved from the death of George Floyd, from the uproar of the Black Lives Matter movement. And this is just important to me because the information that we're sharing and disseminating to businesses is key. These are important conversations that we're having. So if you can go on to the next slide for me, please. The agenda for today is super straightforward. You've just heard from myself and Steve, and then there's going to be a panelist discussion with Q&A, which you guys can just put your questions into the Q&A box. That's going to be moderated by Steve Kenzie, and then at the end, just a wrap up, and we're going to get final remarks from Hannah Smith. That's it. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Cynthia. So as I mentioned, we have fantastic speakers joining us today. Hannah Smith, Global Human Resources Transformation Consultant from HSBC, Opeyemi Sofaluke, the EMEA Lead for Global Technology, Diversity and Inclusion at JP Morgan, and Steve Cunningham, Director of Talent from BT. Three big companies that are very engaged in these issues, and our panelists have a lot of wisdom to share with us. So let's get stuck in. And I'm going to start with a big general question that we'll ask all of you, but let's start with Steve. In your opinion, what are the biggest barriers to advancement and promotion that Black talent face in business today?
Thank you, Steve, and thank you for the introduction to the call. One thing to sort of start with, I think, is what's great about these calls is that they keep the dialogue going. And in answer to your question, I think I would probably start there about dialogue and transparency of data. So one of the biggest obstacles I think we're all finding is many of the issues that we're seeing are hidden in plain sight, but driving the same degree of action and movement that we saw on gender, for example, over the last 10, 15 years, certainly in the companies I've worked at, has required that what's hidden in plain sight to be brought out through data, through really being transparent about who are we hiring and who are we losing. And I see some of the previous seminars have sort of covered some of that information. But so the first one I think would be transparency of data. The second is even much simpler, which is role models. In the history of BT, it's been really interesting to look at the history and the ebbs and flows of talent into BT from specifically the Black community, where we have had role models, where we have had sponsors, active pullers through, and people in the market actively representing and being seen as a visible sign of what's possible for underrepresented talent. That makes a massive difference, and it ebbs and flows. And when those role models disappear, we see a corresponding flow through in terms of what then happens, because without that role model, without that pool, without that sponsor, we quickly see good talent pools quickly dissipate. So to answer the question, Steve, I think there's a lot about role modeling and pulling through, and not just letting, forgive me, I work in HR, I've worked in HR for sort of certainly the last 20 years, not letting the HR process, which is mainly about fit, many of our processes are about finding a good fit for a job. And that's not the same as looking for potential for the future and looking in places that otherwise wouldn't be uncovered. So that pull through, I think, is really important. I better hand over to some of my colleagues who would have a different view, I think.
Thanks, Steve. That's really helpful. And I'm going to come back to a couple of those points because I think you've raised some really interesting issues there. Ape, over to you. What's your view of the biggest barriers right now?
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for welcoming me onto this panel. I would say one of the biggest barriers is not having the access to social capital. And what I mean by this is the relationships that really create opportunities for advancement. When you think about the working environment, typically speaking, the corporate environment is a white environment. And often you find Black employees or Black talent haven't really built those meaningful relationships or had the opportunity to build those relationships that will help them to advance in their careers. And linked very closely to this is lack of sponsors. We often hear that mentorship and sponsorship is absolutely effective and critical when it comes to progressing in one's career. And if talent or if Black talent don't have those sponsors, someone who's advocating for them, someone who has access to the rooms that they can't actually be in, if they don't have someone in their corner, then again, not having those opportunities to advance or to be promoted. And then I think sometimes we also have to look internally, and one of those areas I would say, or a barrier that Black talent can face, is kind of linked to what Steve said around role models, is imposter syndrome. There's this saying, you cannot be what you do not see. And when you look at senior leaders in organizations across the corporate industry, very rarely do you see many Black leaders. So often you find that Black talent face that imposter syndrome where they are sometimes discouraged from going for those senior opportunities or from advancing because they don't see anyone else that looks like them. And it makes you, question, if I don't see anyone that looks like me in these positions, can I really do it? And of course the answer is yes, but we really need to definitely have more sponsorship in place to make that possible, and also training and development in place to help employees and Black talent recognize that that imposter syndrome should not be there, and of course they can advance throughout their careers.
Thanks, Ape. Hannah, is there anything left for you to add?
Yeah, there is. I was worried there wouldn't be because Stephen and Apeyemi made some great points. I just think back to when I was at BT, because Steve, I actually started my career at BT, and I was I think I was the only Black female graduate in the whole intake of, I don't know, over 100 graduates. And I think with this question, I'd probably want to look at it from two angles. I think there's one of kind of the culture, so looking at negative stereotypes when it comes to Black people in the workplace. I almost feel like we start at a minus and have to work our way up. The stereotypes around us being not as educated, not I don't know, capable. It almost seems as if, oh, will they actually be able to do this? And then we kind of have to work our way up. And there's this issue of kind of us always being bundled with the BAME title, and actually people of Asian descent and other ethnic minorities have very different stereotypes attached to them. So where an Indian or an Asian person might be seen as really good at maths or really good with tech, Black people are normally seen more in the good at music, good at sport. So when we enter these corporate spaces, we have to prove ourselves, and actually it's not okay for us to ever be average. We always have to be completely exceeding, which we should all be aiming to do anyway. But it can be quite frustrating when you see your white counterparts who you see as mediocre getting those promotions ahead of you, and you have to almost break your back in order to get the same promotion. But in the other way I'd like to look at it is when it comes to Black people ourselves and how we navigate the workplace. And I think sometimes because of our cultural differences, that can also act as a barrier as to why we're not advancing and getting promoted. So for me, for example, my background, I'm from Ghana. And I don't know if you guys know anyone from Ghana, but we're very humble, very quiet. And this is a stereotype. I'm sure not everyone from Ghana is like this, but we're kind of told not to speak when adults are talking, don't challenge authority. And then when you combine that with also being British, where you can almost be a bit laid back, not too willing to kind of shout about your achievements, you can then get yourself into a place where the kind of characteristics which people look for when it comes to promotion, you're not showing, you're not speaking up in meetings, you're not being assertive, and you're not showing your full self. So I think there's a bit of coaching that's also needed for Black people to be able to actually come up with some of those things which are inside in order for them to be seen and promoted.
Thank you. All good stuff. Now, we've identified some problems. We would be remiss if we didn't turn our attention to some solutions. So maybe circling back to the data, Steve, are there parallels? We've discussed this in some of the previous sessions, some interesting ideas about ethnicity pay gap, about the stay gap, which I thought was really interesting in regard to retention. When the gender pay gap reporting requirements were being mooted, there was some noise about the difficulties of gathering that data and understanding it. But my impression was that, in fact, most companies were already collecting that data. They just weren't making it public, or they're collecting it in some form. In your view, are companies collecting the data, and they have a pretty good sense of where things are at when it comes to ethnic diversity within their organizations, but they're not sharing it? So is the problem the transparency? Is the problem that the data is not being collected? Bit of both.
Yeah, what also, data is a means to an end for transparency, right? So data in of itself doesn't create a solution to what we're talking about, but the transparency and the dialogue does, because a lot of the philosophical or debates that happen in companies across different touch points. So if you take the number of touch points that HR could rightfully claim would need to be addressed in order to change the dial, and that can be from attraction all the way through to assessment, all the way through to promotion, through to the whole range of different touch points. I don't think, certainly in my experience, the data hasn't existed to be able to be reliably informed about the differences when you break it down beneath the dreaded BAME word. Nobody wants to use BAME because for the same reasons that we were just describing. The characteristics and the needs of different groups are not clumped together in that way in real life. So my sense is, certainly from the organizations that I'm talking to, they've had some of the data, but they haven't had the framework and the appetite in order to drill down into those domains of ethnicity to really understand what is different from an Indian or a Black Caribbean or a Afro-Caribbean perspective, and recognize touch point by touch point where it is that we're falling down. And I think that's the upside, and there is no upside of Black Lives Matter that anybody wants to sort of to celebrate, but the upside is getting the dialogue and the transparency and the courage for those conversations to be happening at a very senior level, rather than avoiding those conversations and just leaving them happen in the sort of corridors and letting them happen in small offices, happening on a large scale in a safe way that enables people to look at the data, look at the transparency and say, well, what does this mean for me and my behavior in that touch point, or aggregately as a whole, as a leader or a colleague in a company of some size, as all three of these companies are that we're talking about today.
Do you think there's a sufficient understanding of this is something I'm gonna maybe circle back to, but the distinction between the clearly there's a right and wrong, there's a moral issue here that discrimination is wrong and that should be addressed without question. But obviously in business, sometimes there also needs to be a stronger impetus may come from a business case. And does that need to be made more clear, the business case for diversity? It seems so obvious that diversity is going to make a company stronger and more successful. It should be a no-brainer, and it should take it right out of the framework of if a senior management, just to fulfill their fiduciary duties to their company, should be advocates for diversity. Is that a
Yeah, well, I mean, to some degree, we've travelled down the road on gender, and I'm going to quote my old boss, and I'm sure he won't mind me quoting him. Ronald Shellikens, who's at Vodafone now at PepsiCo, said, "If I have to make a business case to you about why we should have diversity, you're in the wrong company." Now, I think that's true. I think that's true. What I'm noticing is different about the dialogue's been had over the last 6 months is what is the benchmark? What is the data? So an argument I often am finding myself happening in and outside of HR is, well, if the average population, if the national population is 11%, and we've got 11% of underrepresented or ethnic colleagues, job done. 11%, 11%. So, but that isn't the issue. The issue is, if you look at a company of the size of BT, where are we? You know, are we in London? The average in London is not 11%. If you look in our London offices, if you look, so I think there's a passion and a purpose that exists here, which the data supports, but you cannot run away from is it fair? Is it a level playing field? And what needs to happen differently on those touch points in order to make a significant difference to the lives of colleagues who otherwise wouldn't get the chance? I don't think that's a business case. I think that's a belief backed up by data.
Hannah, Opeyemi, any?
Yeah, I was just going to add to the data point. I think data is extremely critical, but at the same time, I think that it's something that companies tend to hide behind. You know, we haven't got the data, we're trying to gather the data. And I think alongside doing that, also have an action plan, actually put in measurable programs that are going to shift the dial. I don't think we need to see the data in some of these big organizations to say it's not good enough. There's not enough senior leadership. There's no one for kind of, you know, more junior colleagues in the organization to look up to say, wow, you know, there's this many Black senior leaders. So as much as I believe in the data and us getting it to understand it, I think if we keep hiding behind that, we're not going to make as much progress as we need to make. And then I think also on that data point, I feel like there's quite a few what would I say, white middle-aged men who feel that actually with all these programs coming into play that they're somehow at a disadvantage. And I think to Steve's point around transparency of data, if they were able to see just how many middle-aged white men are in some of these senior positions, they would understand that actually, you know, something does need to be done. So I think there's a big point here around, let's be as proactive as we can around getting data. Let's make it transparent, but let's not use that as an excuse not to move forward in some of the much needed initiatives in order to really shift the dial.
I think to add to that, when you think about data, you have to think about the story that you want to tell. You know, we all know what the picture looks like. We've just discussed it now. But essentially, the point goes to how we're making progress, and data enables you to track that progress. And that's where it can be quite effective, because yes, particularly within the tech industry, it is a bit of a bleak picture, right? You know, it's not diverse enough, and there definitely can be more that we all do to improve diversity, both within the industry, but across the corporate sector as a board. But the benefit of having data and being able to track data and go back to data is you're able to see your progress and identify gaps, and then circle back to the organization, like Hannah just mentioned, what are the measurable things we can do to start to change this landscape? So for me, data is effective in telling a story, and it helps us to track our progress when it comes to diversity and inclusion.
Last question on this. If a company's behind in this area, where do they start? What are the metrics, the sort of first indicator on ethnic diversity that they should start gathering data on? Is it just that overall ethnic mix? Should just collecting, just getting that bare bones, what is the ethnic makeup of our workforce? Is that?
I think it goes across the board. So I think if you look at attraction, when it comes to entry-level talent, having an understanding of how diverse your entry-level talent is, that gives you an indication of where are we recruiting? Do we need to start looking in, you know, places where we can find diverse Black talent? So for example, in the United States, there are HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. So it's not a point that the talent doesn't exist. Of course, the talent is out there, but are we looking for the talent? So again, from an entry point of view, that's one place to start. But then also internally, looking at your attrition rates, how many Black employees are leaving? And if a high number of Black employees are leaving, then there needs to be a drill down to understand why and get to that root cause. Do managers need more training? Are the teams that they're in not diverse enough? You know, do we need to do more unconscious bias training? Are there mentorship and sponsorship programs that we need to put Black employees on? So again, it's about really understanding the data at different points, from entry level, so how we're recruiting, but also when it comes to advancing our talent. So I've spoken about, you know, attrition rates, but also promotion, which this is all about, advancement. How many of our Black employees are advancing compared to other employees? And again, that helps you to hopefully identify a gap, and you can do root cause analysis to understand why that is the case, and start to work on programs or initiating programs to deal with these issues.
Thank you. Okay. You, sponsorship has come up and mentorship has come up with all of you. Also noting that there is a dearth of Black senior leadership. And in any organization, it's a pyramid. So there's always going to be perhaps more demand for sponsors and mentors than there is senior executives with the time to dedicate to that. So again, I want to shift over to solutions. Lack of sponsors is a problem. How do we address that? Are there actions happening in your companies now that are addressing that? Something that we could share and maybe get other companies to pick up on? Go ahead, Steve.
The mentors and sponsors assumes a degree of understanding. So a couple of things we've done at BT, and again, I'm not claiming sort of that we've there are some twists and turns in this journey. Some will be successful, some will not be. So time will tell whether or not these really give the dividends. But the first one was around reverse mentoring. Do we have enough execs who actually understand the lived experiences of a Black colleague or an Indian colleague in the UK? So the first one is actually not about putting, but just a basic conversation, which is, can you put yourselves in the shoes of somebody who isn't white, middle-aged, grey-haired, glasses, and have a different origin, a different background, a different story, and we found that incredibly powerful to start a dialogue, which is not actually about problem solving collectively yet. It's about individually spending time and understanding, and on top of that, then you focus on the fast track, then you focus on the sort of acceleration, mentoring and sponsoring of talent, because that, in a way, that the execs are more comfortable with that. They're more comfortable having a dialogue with somebody that they can see the potential of, regardless of background, and then figure out ways of developing their career. But actually understanding and pausing and reflecting and learning about why the situation arose in the first place, which starts well before colleagues join us at work. There's a background, there's an education thing, and we saw it in the summer with the debate about the GCSEs and the A-level results. There's something wrong in how some of these communities are seeing role models and seeing fairness play out even before the workplace, and encouraging people to understand that rather than just assume that they can sponsor one person and that's their job done. I think we found that a really valuable way of starting the dialogue and making that happen across BT.
I think just a couple of points on what you said there, Steve. I think it's interesting when we think about mentoring and sponsorship that we go straight to the highest levels of an organization. I think it would be really good if companies could start kind of encouraging more middle managers to actually start acting as mentors and sponsors to some of the younger generation coming up. I say that because middle managers actually have more time than people right at the top, and actually can dedicate that time to give them useful kind of feedback and advice to really kind of influence how they navigate their careers. But apart from that, I think your point on reverse mentoring, and I know in HSBC, Embrace has launched their mentoring program, and they're also going to be releasing reverse mentoring early next year. But the issue that I sometimes have with reverse mentoring is because in past organizations that I've been in, it's almost the young Black colleague has to now defend themselves to a more experienced colleague on why racism exists. They have to kind of all of these, really intelligent questions with, loads of words with over 4 syllables thrown at them, and they need to now kind of defend themselves. They need to explain why they feel the way that they feel. And actually, it's really exhausting, and it's a lot of emotional labor that goes into that. So I think even as we think about our reverse mentoring programs, how do we actually protect some of these young people going into these relationships? How do we make sure that people who are on the other side of it understand that actually they may not have all the answers, but it doesn't invalidate how they feel about certain situations? So I think we just need to be really careful around reverse mentoring as a whole. And I think one thing that I just really valued when I was a graduate at BT was that I had a middle manager kind of look out for me, some of the unwritten rules around how people are perceived. So for example, she would talk to me about stakeholder management, and she said, Hannah, I never go into a presentation without everyone who's there already having seen it and given me their feedback. And it's little things like that that you may not notice. You go in and you've just got these slides up, and all of a sudden, that's wrong, I don't agree with that. But actually a lot of that was cut out when you have like pre-meets with people before you actually enter the meeting. Things like you want to be noticed, and then the next day I came in with a pink blazer and she was like, not like that. So it's those little things. And I think we need to understand that over 80% of an employee's experience is based on that middle management level, as opposed to the people right at the top, because the people at the top are always saying the right things. The people at the bottom always want the right things, and it's in the middle where it can break down. So I think that's where we need to focus on our training.
Yeah, I mean, we had safety as a sort of number one principle of the reverse mentoring, and it's not actually about youth. It could be a graduate cohort, it could be someone who's been BT for 40 years. So it was actually about that entire spectrum of the experience. But yeah, no,
And I think added to that, also creating communities where people can grow and develop. And it's linked to mentorship, but having kind of safe bubbles where you can connect. And this is where business resource groups are extremely effective. When I joined JP Morgan, there are a number of business resource groups that you can join, and BOLD, which is the Black Organisation for Leadership Development, was one of them. And it was an opportunity for me to connect with other Black employees, learn about their experiences. Sometimes you want to find someone who's relatable, that you can kind of pick their brains. They've been in the organization for a few more years than you. And I found those kind of networks are also extremely effective. So they may not have been a mentor or a sponsor, but they were part of a community group where, for me, it was a safe space to ask the questions that maybe I didn't feel so comfortable asking someone who was a lot more senior to me. And then peer mentoring also is effective. We've spoken about reverse mentoring, but having someone who is on the same level as you, or just a few years ahead of you in the career, that you can connect with and seek advice from. I think the benefit of mentors, they kind of coach you, essentially. They coach you, they guide you. You can ask those questions that you may not feel comfortable asking a more senior leader. And then sponsors are there to essentially shine a light on you. So both relationships are very important, but I think we shouldn't forget the value of also a community that you can connect with.
I think those are really helpful suggestions that takes the moving from where we have scarce supply of mentors at the top of the organization into middle management, and where in fact there may be greater benefit to the mentor as well. Those middle managers are going to get more benefit from having a mentorship on their CV than the senior people will. So there's a real win-win there. And a resource group, of course, just taking it to scale, allowing more people to benefit from that exchange of support. I think those are great ideas. Now I'm gonna just have a look at some of the questions that have been coming in, and encourage our audience to please do add more. Um, well, one specifically for you, Steve, around what do you think you're doing differently to ensure that there's a strong pipeline for Black talent? But I think I'd be interested to hear from Hannah and Opeyemi on that in terms of your organizations, to the extent you can speak to that. Do you feel there is a pipeline, as far as that goes, that you do have a route to senior positions?
Yeah, well, it certainly feels the last, and I've made reference to it before. The journey feels similar, but much more urgent than the gender story of 10, 15 years ago. And yeah, that battle has not been won either. But what I've definitely seen is, we called it the, as you would in a sort of company like BT, the ethnicity rapid action plan, which was really designed to corral the feedback from the ethnic networks into what needs to actually happen now in order to get ourselves beginning on a journey, not necessarily to solve it. And in there, things like looking at the touch points that we've described through the graduate through to the middle manager. Is there an inflection point where we're seeing a difference in and people are being left behind, or that isn't being robustly managed? Targeting specific skill groups and universities. We're working with an organization called Alito to encourage our managers to mentor and sponsor people at university and graduate level. So not leaving it to the sort of the graduate process just to try and hoover up grads, but actually get involved in universities and in schools much earlier in life to try and do that. And then of course the executive pipelines, identify who those talent are, internally, making sure they do have somebody who can pull through, actually, so somebody who can represent them and look for opportunities for that individual, rather than leaving it to the HR process or to the line manager to try and find opportunities to create transparency. And shortlists. So our commitment has been that at the sort of top 1,000 level of the company, we will ensure that there is a diverse shortlist, which of course can mean gender, ethnicity, or can mean the full range of diversity. That has to be in place in order to encourage more people to apply, whereas before they may not have put themselves forward. So that's the sort of range of things that we're doing under the ethnicity rapid action plan.
Yeah, I would say added to that is doing networking nights. In the same way, similar to what Steve mentioned, there's been a focus on gender, where we may have a networking evening where we invite women in technology to come hear about the firm and opportunities we have available. The same can be done for ethnic minority groups and specifically Black groups. And there are a number of organizations externally, for example, Black Women Talk Tech, which is an organization we've partnered with both in the US and in the UK to run events where Black women across technology come into the organization and connect. And the talent is out there, so it's not scarce. The talent's out there. It's about us also being intentional when it comes to finding these organizations and groups. There's BYP, Black Women Talk Tech, the UK Black Business Show. There are a number of organizations out there where you can find Black talent. So identifying these groups and then running events where such talent can come in and connect with your organization is definitely a way of recruiting more diverse talent.
Sorry, just nodding away. I agree with everything you guys said. In HSBC, I've only been here for 6 months, so I'm not sure exactly what's happening. So anyone in HSBC who knows, feel free to put it in the chat. But I think for me, the obvious thing to do would be to look at what's been done for gender and replicate. I feel like it's really worked in terms of getting women into senior positions, and we shouldn't be shy about putting in the same type of measures for when it comes to ethnicity. I think that's the only way we're really going to shift the dial. We need to have some clear targets and just be proactive about it. And I think even when it comes to our hiring practices, I have to give, say a massive well done to HSBC, because I just feel like my recruitment process was so fair. I talk about it to whoever wants to listen. I mean, we had to do a case study and it was completely anonymous. And, just knowing that I wasn't going to be judged on the piece of work as a Black person, but actually this is just all the pieces of work and the two best go through to the final interview. And just knowing that my work matched that standard made me feel like I had got in based on merit, that I was going to be of value to the company, etc. And I think that really does help with morale. And I think actually this vision that we all kind of have around the workplace being a meritocracy. I was listening to a webinar with John Amici. I don't know if you guys know him, but he was saying that until we get that out of our head, you know, that our workplaces are a meritocracy, we're not going to be able to advance, because if it is a meritocracy, then that would mean that everyone who is in their current position is supposed to be there, and therefore doing anything to tip that over is now making it unfair. But actually, if we say that people are there because of, you know, the circumstances, what school they went to, who they know, who they were able to network with, etc., then we can understand that if people don't have access to those type of opportunities, then they will never get into those positions. So we do need to do things proactively, like we did with the women, to make sure that we are balancing the playing field.
You've teed up my next question really well, and an anonymous attendee was thinking the same thing around targets, and the, for me anyway, obvious continuation of a conversation on targets. Eventually, you may get to quotas, and this is a big debate that's happening around on the gender front, to be sure, and the idea around women on boards, and is a target sufficient? It's just not moving fast enough, and should we start having quotas? And Steve, your point about diverse shortlists, where do we put the targets? Is it in hiring? Is it at the shortlist? Is it somewhere else in the process? For access to training, do we need to have targets and quotas to ensure that that Black colleagues are represented there? And again, to come back to data, I suppose, if we discover that they're not represented in training, is that because, why is that? So quotas, are we ready for that? Is that, you know, so some women argue against quotas because they don't want to have to justify that they're in a position because of a quota. Where do you feel, where do you land on this?
Well, I don't think we are going to quotas, and I don't think it's healthy to have a quota. I don't think there's anybody getting to numbers and representation is really important, because it's lovely that you have an executive of 10 men describing diversity, but it only really makes a difference when you have 3 women or three colleagues with it. You need numbers. You need numbers around not just the top table, but in the business. But I think the downside of quotas is, just as Hannah was describing, if you don't feel you got that job because of who you are, you got it for any other reason, I think it's an undermining route to inclusion. Targets, yes, and yeah, again, we all know we can look at targets for recruitment much easier than you can from within, because you want to set the same bar for everybody. And what I hear time and time again, actually, from our colleagues in BT is, we don't want to be given that. We want to earn it. Yeah, we want to have that same bar applied to everybody. We don't want there to be a different bar that applies for me. So I think targets, yes. Quotas, no. And targets over time, because, and we touched on it today, every year there's 1,000 decisions that dictates who gets promoted and who doesn't. 1,000 individual tiny little choices that are made that create a healthier pipeline and a more diverse pipeline. Helping people understand their part to play at each of those touch points, I think, is much more important than saying you will have one colleague who is hired who's a female, one is Black, and one is white. I think that would be unhealthy.
But Steve, were there any quotas for women for BT, or was it always targets?
No, targets. Yeah, we had an organisation I used to work at, which shall be nameless. Actually, we changed the dial significantly on diversity by an approach called +1, which was each executive needed one more female in year than last year. And I think I'm scarred a little bit by a conversation of somebody I had who joined the company, who was then told, oh great, you're the plus one.
Mm,
And I
oh
remember how
gosh.
she felt. I remember how she felt there.
Yeah.
And yeah, so not quotas but targets, and
Yeah.
pushing towards and holding people to accountable to targets, because like I said earlier, the benchmark is really important. Just because the national average of ethnicity is 11%, that doesn't necessarily mean that should be our target. We are in big cities. Let's think about setting a higher bar for where we should be represented, and aim for that over time. That would be my view.
I think your point, yeah, I think your point makes sense that it should be targets, but at the same time, I think my biggest thing is whatever was put in place for women, we should really think about repurposing that for Black people specifically and ethnic minorities, because I just see the massive difference that it's had over the span of my career in terms of, you know, how much that's shifted. But as well as that, I think even when we look at hiring panels, making sure that we're making them as diverse as possible to be able to give some of those candidates who are coming through a fighting chance. Because I think sometimes the issue that we have is even when Black people rise, there's still always that, you know, how can they actively kind of help the ones who are coming after them? I think of myself, and a couple of months ago, I had to recruit people for my team, and I had a really diverse group that I interviewed. But actually, when it came down to it, I was actually having conversations with my husband. Is it okay if I hire a Black person? Will they think I hired that person only because they're Black? And, you know, I don't think, and anyone on here correct me if I'm wrong, that white people ever sit there and say, is it okay for me to hire this white person? Do you know what I mean? So I think that even though there's a Black person on the panel, doesn't mean that they are going to advocate for the Black person sitting in the interview to get that job, because actually they're also scared about coming across that they're only defending this person because they are also Black. And that's why allies really need to step up and, you know, not just have that title, but it's a verb. They need to be active, and they need to stand up, because just because a Black person is in a senior position doesn't mean that we're going to get that support coming up. We still need allies to absolutely have our backs, because otherwise we're just going to end up kind of in that middle management, not really able to rise, because the white people are expecting the Black people at senior levels to help the other ones rise. But actually it can never be on one person. It can never be on one random you know, senior manager to help the rest of us come up.
Yeah, well said.
Okay, we are officially out of time for this segment, and as always, our audience have come through with a lot of questions, and I want to give you all just particularly Opeyemi and Steve, maybe a chance for a final word, and we're going to hear from Hannah. You get a bigger wrap up, so maybe we'll hold off there. But you know, there's a bunch of interesting questions here, and I think if you wouldn't mind, maybe anything that you didn't get to say that you were hoping you might, this is your chance. But towards the practical, there's a question. Someone's noted that the three of you are all from large organizations that have well-established programs. So if you could think back to when you were in organizations that were less developed in this area, and maybe give us a turn to the practical guidance for you know, someone in a company that means well, but they're just late to they're late to this, and they want to catch up, and where do you think the key things to get started on? And I think we've covered some of this through employee resource groups and creating opportunities for mentorship and sponsorship. But Opeyemi, over to you.
I would say that even in a small organization, or no matter the size of the organization, it's really about creating a shared responsibility, a culture of a shared responsibility, where it's everybody's role to advocate for Black people or minority groups. And for me, it starts at the top. Leaders in organizations, whether large or small, need to nurture a culture of inclusion where everybody feels that they can develop, but also where Black talent feels that they are valued, that they're respected, that they are supported to reach their potential or the positions that they're seeking to get to. So for me, whether the organization is large or small, each individual, like I think Hannah mentioned earlier about being an ally. So if you are a non-Black person, be an actual ally, not a performative ally. It's not just about posting on LinkedIn or posting on social media, but how can you actually help someone in your organization? If there is an opportunity that comes up, for example, which gives someone visibility, and you know that there is a Black person in your team or in the organization that you could put forward, then put that person forward, give them that access. You know, simple things as well, like, you know, it doesn't always have to be let's go for drinks after work, because everybody knows that there is a massive British drinking culture, and we often, a lot of relationships are forged at the bar, but somebody, you know, for me, from my culture, it's not that big of a thing to go to the pub. So when I first started out in my career, that's not always something I felt like I wanted to do, but I did go along because I knew the impact of it. But finding other ways for Black talent or employees to build those relationships are also key. So I think it's like, it could be the small things, but just being aware and intentional of how you can create opportunities for colleagues is key.
Thanks very much, Opeyemi. Yes, to that, in our previous session, we spoke about the importance of pheasant shooting for career advancement in some sectors, and how unfair that was for people that didn't have a culture of pheasant shooting. Steve, over to you for your final words.
Yeah, well, Opeyemi's sort of nailed it. So I'll add to it rather than create something new. In a smaller company, there's so much there's so much stuff on the internet that you could just draw in and encourage people to access it. Black Lives Matter, just a wee bit of education, which is curated, and encourage safe conversations in the small company. And then, just to take on the idea that Opeyemi was just saying, actively get into the community and be a talent scout. You know, go and have a look, go and find talent, whether that's mentoring or coaching or whatever it is. Go and find it, because it's there. It just hasn't been found by you. And when you bring people in, just interview with 2 people, please, not just with one person sat in a room. There are too many biases and things that play out in a one-on-one if you haven't got somebody with you just to sort of look from a slightly different perspective. So they would be the sort of 3 tangible things I would encourage smaller organizations to do, and self-help and make it safe.
Perfect. Thank you, Steve. Hannah, over to you for the last word and a call to action, if you please.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Cynthia did tell me I was doing this, so I have prepared, and I love my acronyms. So in terms of my call to action, I've labeled it so it's black, so everyone can remember that. So the B of that is brave. I think there's no growth without discomfort. I think from both sides, I think companies need to get uncomfortable having some of these tough conversations, understanding the reality of where they are, and actually, you know, doing things which may not appeal to everyone to really shift the dial. And I think in the same way, Black colleagues need to be brave. They need to start kind of being more proactive in terms of searching for mentors, searching for coaching, having the help that they need to really advance in the organization that they're in. The L is for leadership. I think that the leadership teams need to understand where the biggest impact is. And I think I said this earlier, it's around that middle management layer and making sure that managers are trained up. So when someone becomes a line manager, not just to do some, 20-minute video course on what that means to be a line manager, but actually investing in some of these managers, because as Black colleagues going through the organization, if we have managers who are not supportive, people who always trying to push our achievements down, looking at us negatively when it comes to performance management point of view, it's almost impossible to stay, which leads to the issue in retention, and we end up leaving the organization. And when you move too many times, yes, you can increase your salary, but are you able to move upwards and take your career in the direction that you actually want to go in? The A is for action plans. I think we have to get away with big headlines like we're going to double the amount of Black leaders. If that's one Black leader, then that's not really doing much. So we need to actually just focus on what's the action, what are we going to do differently? And when we do have some of those plans, making sure that people know about them. You know, don't just do a program for the highest 1%, you know, top performing Black people in the organization. How about the people who are in the top 10%? You know, I feel like as Black people, we're always pushing this narrative that if you're not the very, very best, then you can't get promoted, whereas mediocre white people can. So I think we also need to make sure that our action plans are as inclusive as possible. The C is for connect. So organizations should be connecting with people who are good in the space. If there are organizations who have got this right in terms of their diversity and inclusion, then they need to be connecting with them, finding out what works and actually partnering with them. It's not about, we've got a tiny group of HR people, which are mostly white ladies, working on this problem, but actually getting external consultants, getting HR, getting Black people in the organization to feed into this, to make sure that it's something that's actually fit for purpose. And then the K is keep going. I know a lot of what I said sounded really negative, but I think as long as we're doing something, that's the main thing. So we just need to keep going and know that any step we take it's a good step if it's in the right direction. So thanks everyone. And Cynthia did tell me to also say, please check out the next webinar. And if you've missed the other ones, then go back and listen to those as well. Thank you guys.
Thank you very much, Hannah, Opeyemi, and Steve. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you this afternoon, and your insights have been tremendously valuable to our audience. We are just about out of time, just enough to hand over to Cynthia to say a few words about the final session in the series. Cynthia.
Wow. Oh, I am actually blown away by all of our panelists. So thank you guys so much for taking part and for spreading all of your wisdom. I hope everyone had an opportunity to really listen to what these guys said. Please do join our final session. It is really, in my mind, going to end with a bang and really looking at that top-down piece. Our confirmed speakers are Sandra Odhiambo, the CEO and Executive Director of the UN Global Compact, Kevin Ellis, the Chairman and Senior Partner, PwC, and Kate, wow, I'm unable to speak, Rollinson, CEO from MediaCom UK. I just want to say thank you again to NatWest Group for sponsoring and supporting this entire webinar series and allowing for these important conversations to take place. Please do leave your feedback at the end. And yeah, thank you guys so much for taking part in the discussion. It was great.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.